Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today I want to discuss something. It's kind of specific in terms of movies, but it's something that's been happening a lot more lately, and I'm going to use a movie that's currently in production as an example of this, and that is uh, Bill and Ted Face the Music, or Bill and Ted 3. Um, Now, here's the thing with this movie is that I always have a bad feeling for the most part whenever they try to do a sequel and it's a number of years later. And when I say a number, I mean, anywhere from 15 to 20 years later. Um, this has happened recently with a few other films. They did it with Dumb and Dumber. They did it with, they've done it with Star Wars a couple of times, but they've done it with a lot of other movies where they've come again, especially recently, where they've come out with sequels to them. Years and years and years down the road. Blade Runner is another good example. Um, and here's the thing: is that I don't think Hollywood gets the fact that they it works for some things and not others. A lot of films are microcosms of when they were made. In terms of, an 80s movie feels like an 80s movie. If you make a sequel to an 80s movie, set it in modern times, but keep the 80s themes, it's not going to do very well because it's not the fucking 80s. And for those of you that are wondering about that, it has been done successfully before, in my eyes anyway, even though the film did not get a sequel, and that was with Tron Legacy. Um, Now, the difference is that Tron Legacy was largely based on stuff involving technology and the visuals and stuff like that, and that translated very much so over into modern day, where more people like stuff like video games, and you updated the graphics. You still got the old characters back for the people that didn't know them before, but you really kind of put them in the background. You have newer characters in the front, and the newer characters are relatively fleshed out throughout the film. Tron Legacy works. Tron Legacy does work, and it is a sequel that came out, I believe, 28 years after the original. Um, Actually, no, it might be an even 30 actually, because it came out, I believe, in 2012, and the original film, I believe, was 1982. So it can be done successfully, but the problem is that when you do stuff, especially with comedies are especially hard. And you look at stuff like Dumb and Dumber, because if you don't have a snappy writer in order to make that comedy good, and in order to in order to update it, but not to retread on territory you've already done, it's tough. And comedy sequels in general, I think, are the toughest sequels to make, because you have to make new jokes and you have to carry on from the first film instead of just calling back. A lot of comedy sequels make the mistake of they just call back to all the jokes in the first one. If you do that, your comedy sequel is going to be complete shit, because people have already seen those jokes before. So, The Hangover 2 is a good example of that, where essentially they just change up a little bit of the variables in the jokes, but the jokes are ultimately the same. Instead of marrying a prostitute, like in the first Hangover, the he marries, or he and instead of marrying a prostitute, he goes and he has sex with a transvestite whore. Okay, so same thing. He just, you went from a prostitute to a transvestite whore. So um, it's really just one of those things that this is going to be a hard production for people to do stuff, because it's not going to be very easy to update Bill and Ted. Again, you have two movies that I believe one came out in the very late 80s and one came out in the very early 90s. I could be mistaken about that. I think actually maybe they both came out in the early 90s, but the fact of the matter is that you're updating this and you're hoping that you're going to get those people back, and you're going to draw in those Keanu Reeves fans, that have been so rabid lately. And Keanu Reeves I think, is a legitimately good actor. I love the John Wick films. The first Matrix is really good. Speed, he's a really good action guy, and he was funny in the first two Bill and Ted's. I thought he was very funny in those films, but it had its time, it had its era, where a lot of it was, the dumb stoner comedy, essentially, is what it was. Even though I can't remember if we actually see them smoking weed in the movie, but that's essentially what that was. And then that you went from that, and you went in the late '90s. You went into the teen boner sex comedy. Because then you had like American Pie and all the sequels to that and all the spin-offs and all that crap, and you had those movies that were coming out around that time, Not Another Teen Movie, stuff like that. Then you moved even further. You moved into these these ensemble films like The Hangover and Bridesmaids and stuff like that. Humor has evolved over time, and if you're going to cherry pick something from the early '90s and place it in modern day in terms of a humor aspect, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to work on the general audience. And I think a lot of the people that liked the original two Bill and Ted films are not going to be nostalgic enough to recommend this movie, and you're not going to be able to survive off of those people. Now, just looking at the production, they've had a lot of good talent come on. I think a lot of that's probably because of Keanu Reeves, because he carries a lot of pull these days. And, you know, they might do well. This movie might do well. I hope it does well, because I really do like Keanu Reeves, and I feel like he's doing this just because he wants to be really nice to Alex Winter, who's the actor who plays Bill S. Preston. And he's because the guy hasn't probably had a film role, a legitimate one, in like 10 years. Outside Bill and Ted, I think I can name like Death Wish 3 and The Lost Boys are the only other two movies that I remember him from, and those were in the 80s. So it's going to be interesting to see what goes on going forward. I'm very interested to see a first trailer for this, but I feel like when it comes to this kind of stuff, it's more miss than hits. And if the stuff is not translatable from its original era into modern day, then making a sequel a lot of the times will fail, and it will fail miserably. So with that, it's just kind of my opinion on doing a sequel so many years later. And like I said, really the only one I could think of that worked very well was Tron Legacy. So I'd like to hear from you. Do you like any delayed or later sequels? And if so, name them. Or what's your feelings on the new Bill and Ted? Do you think it's going to be a train wreck? Do you think it's going to be something that's actually good? Put your thoughts in the comments. I always like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?